actually, as far as cooperation is concerned, we have to kind of be careful a little bit when we talk about the interplay of egocentrism and cooperation, because the relevance theory actually challenged cooperation. And the relevance theoreticians talked about the fact that, of course, interlocutors are free to be cooperative or uncooperative. And there are basically two reasons why they are or they can be uncooperative, because they have some particular interest, they have some kind of preference, or just they have, do not have the necessary information that they need to be relevant. And this makes sense, but I want to emphasize that in this case, in both cases, we are talking about somehow conscious things. So I have a particular interest, so I'm not necessarily relevant in a given situation, or I don't want to be relevant, at least as I understand this. There is another challenge that comes from cognitive psychology. There are several studies, Bar, Kesar, Geora, Kesar. They claim that speakers and hearers commonly ignore their mutual knowledge when they produce and interpret language. And their behavior is called egocentric because it is rooted in the speaker's and hearer's own knowledge and experience instead of in their mutual knowledge. So the important thing here is that as far as the cognitive psychologists are concerned, they emphasize the subconscious automatic side of this matter, which means that based on my prior experience, certain things just happen or come out of my mouth, and then when I interpret something, you know, my first interpretation is based on my prior experience. Later, I'm going to talk a little bit about the graded salience hypothesis. So the important thing I want to emphasize that as far as, at least as I understand, the relevance theoreticians' claim is concerned, this refers to something different than in the case of the cognitive psychologists who emphasize something that you cannot have. So after all, egocentrism is a loaded word, but we have to be careful with that because actually, as far as the cognitive psychologists understand that, it is not necessarily negative. The question is, how do these two principles affect intercultural pragmatics? I'm going to talk about two things, interculturality and salience. There is a definition there as far as interculturality is concerned. Blumcook et al. In 2008 defined interculturality as a contingent interactional accomplishment from a discursive constructive perspective. They argued that there is a lot of literature there, so they quoted several kind of studies. The problem is that I do not necessarily agree exactly with what they are talking about, but I want to point out something very important that this Japanese scholar Nishizaka said in 1995, although he didn't elaborate very much on that, but he mentioned that interculturality is a situational emergent rather than a normative fixed phenomenon. I think that was a very important claim. In the socio-cognitive approach, interculturality has both relatively normative and emergent components. So that's the important thing that I'd like to emphasize in my definition of intercultures, that intercultures are situationally emergent and co-constructed phenomena that rely both on relatively definable cultural models and norms as well as situationally evolving features. So this is very important that, you know, there are two sides of the matter, that it is not just, you know, everything is co-constructed, but you have a load that you arrive with, you know, into the communicative process, and you cannot deny that, and it is always there. Of course, that will change in the given situational constant. So the intercultures are usually ad hoc creations. They are created in a community process in which cultural norms and models brought into the interaction from prior experience of the interlocutors blend with features created ad hoc in the interaction in a synergistic way. So I want to emphasize that what happens here is basically transformation rather than transmission. So something is transformed, mainly this is the communicative behavior and the actual load that these interlocutors arrive with into the communicative process. So here is an interesting example. A Brazilian and a Brazilian lady and a Polish lady are talking, and the Brazilian says, "And what do you do?" the Polish said, I work at the university as a cleaner. The other says, as a janitor? No, not yet. Janitor is after the cleaner. You want to be a janitor? Of course. So that's an interesting conversation because this shows how they built up this kind of intercultures. So there is nothing like this, that it's a kind of hierarchy in the English language, the cleaner and janitor or whatever. But, they want to understand each other, so they just create something that is non-existing, but they do that because they want to understand each other. Okay, so they arrive into the situation with some kind of load that is there, but that has to be changed. That has to be changed in order for them to understand each other. So this is what they are trying to do basically in this experiment. But there is an interesting question here. Should we distinguish intercultural communication from intercultural communication? That's quite an interesting issue. A lot of people write about it. And basically, the dominant approach to this issue right now is that there is no principal difference between intercultural and intercultural communication. I think this is just partly true. So, and I try to make an attempt to prove that to you. Actually, we have to look at three things if you want to answer this question. One of them is the nature of prior knowledge and sociocultural norms brought into the situation. And the other one is the way co-construction actually works. And the other thing is group inclusiveness. So let's just start with the first. So I'm talking about intercultural communication. So here, speakers rely on their prior knowledge rooted in cultural models of a relatively, I want to emphasize this, relatively definable speech community. This knowledge is privatized and adjusted to actual situations by individuals belonging to that speech community. The important thing is that basically language boundaries are not necessarily crossed in these cases. However, subcultures are relied upon and representations are individualized. And and an interesting thing here is that diachronically, since these intercultures disappear, they do not necessarily contribute to the development of culture in that particular, so diachronically, they actually contribute to enrich the given culture that they belong to with these conversations. Here is an example from one of Clint Eastwood's films, Coogan Bluff. That's the title of the film. And a woman and a man are talking, and the woman, they are sitting in a restaurant, and the woman stands up and says, I have to be going. And she turns to the waiter and says, the check, please. The man, what are you doing? The lady says, Dutch. You are a girl, aren't you? And the woman says, yes, there have been rumors to that effect. And the man says, sit back and act like one. Okay, is that the way girls act in Arizona? So the point here is that, okay, there are these subcultures, they are activated there, but we are still within the confines of a particular culture, and they understand each other very well. And of course, diachronically, my point is that, of course, there is some kind of contribution here by the speakers, however little it is. As far as intercultural communication is concerned, the situation is a little bit different. Why? Because basically the speakers who participate in these communicative processes, they actually belong to different cultures and languages. So what they bring into these situations, they do not necessarily have very much common ground as far as the cultural norms are concerned. So what participate, create on the spot will disappear and not become an enrichment or addition to any particular cultural language. So it is not repeated. It cannot be conventionalized in any way because, these intercultures come and go. So basically, they are ad hoc creations. Although I have to mention that it is not always like this because there are recurring intercultures. Just think about international classrooms, for example. Like, they go for a year or even more. So the same students participate there. There is the same teacher. So definitely they develop some kind of interculture there that lasts at least while the course lasts. Or the negotiation teams, I could mention something. In the European Union, there is an interesting project. You may have heard about it, Barbara Zeidelhofer's project, that they want to kind of create the grammar of English lingua franca. And I have never been able to understand that very well, but how they think that English lingua franca in Europe has some kind of language-like properties. But anyway, my guess is that basically why they are doing this is that they just hope that things will be conventionalized in the long run, in one way or another. So after all, definitely it is not wasted time, in my opinion, to focus on that. Here is another example to demonstrate how these intercultures may be created. Brazilian, a Colombian, and a girl from Hong Kong are talking about au pair. The Brazilian girl is an au pair girl, you know, who works with one of the families there in the Albany area. And she asked, have you ever heard about au pair before? Colombian says, no, what is au pair? It's a French word. We come as an exchange to take care of kids. What kids? Kids in the host family. We live with the host family. By the way, how about the kids? How do you know what to do with them? We have to go to training. So as you see, this is quite a simple situation, and these people speak quite good English. But when they talk to each other, of course, they do not necessarily know exactly at what level the other person is. So they have to kind of figure out that during the communicative process to build up some kind of interculture. So here, in the center of attention is to define what au pair is all about. And of course, they represent different cultures, and they try to create their own interculture on the spot in one way or another. But definitely, when they finish this kind of conversation, then the interculture that they create will probably disappear and never repeated. So there is no hope for them to conventionalize anything that happens in this interculture. There is another thing that I want to mention in connection with the difference between intracultural communication and intercultural communication. So if you ask me how to define what native likeness is all about, I say that native speakers have preferred way of saying things and preferred ways of organizing thoughts. Actually, Alison Ray speaks about preferred way of saying things in another context. But I think that it makes sense in this context as well, and I wrote a study about the issue of preferred ways of organizing thoughts within a particular speech community. So what I understand by this is that Americans say shoot a film, does the furniture, make love, do the dishes, and so on. So there is a kind of way to pick the right words to express certain things. Of course, you can use other words, you know, but they right away recognize you that no matter how good your pronunciation is, because you picked the wrong word, the wrong expression in particular cases. And of course, there are the situations behind utterances, which just had an example earlier between Roy and Susie. You remember that conversation where the expected situation by utterances, I'm fine, but if you use something different, then right away, you know, the whole frame disappears. And it happens quite often when my students come to my office and they ask me, how are you doing, Professor Kescskes? And say, better than you. Right away, you know, they start to laugh. And of course, what happens is that it's a very unusual answer, so they don't know what to say. Some of the students are here, I think. So what I say is